So, good morning. I'm Jeff Collins, Chair of Academic Programs at Bard Graduate Center. And on behalf of our Director, Susan Weber, our Dean, Peter Miller, and all my faculty colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome you to this symposium this morning on American visual material culture of the long 19th century. I want to welcome the speakers, session chairs, of course, who've come from all over the country to join us, those who are participating in person today, and especially those who are joining us via our live stream. And the tag is there, Bard Grad Center TV on Twitter. We invite you to tweet in your questions, and we'll do our best to communicate them to the speakers. This has been a very busy year at Bard Graduate Center, and I just learned from Laura that we put on something like 40 or 50 events. Higher. How many? 55 events in our academic and research programs, not to mention our other events oriented to the public and all the classes. And these have ranged from very informal brown bag luncheons to pop-up workshops, more formal endowed evening series and seminars. And this, I think, is one of our very last, if not our last event of the year. And I think it's a particularly good way to close, not just because symposia like this one are really the flagship of our research program, but I think there's three really particular reasons intrinsic to today's topic that make it a great closing event. First of all, this symposium that David's put together really helps us live up to BGC's longstanding focus on New York and American material culture. That's actually something that we articulate as one of our 6 areas of special strength. And that is obviously pursued not just through our teaching program, but publications, exhibition program, main gallery exhibitions like Circus in the City, but especially the Focus Project, at which David is one of our leading members, and I think you're all very aware of his continuing engagement in 19th century New York in this program. And this is a wonderful kind of introduction to the new exhibition that will be coming up on the New York Crystal Palace. So that cluster of faculty and courses and sustained student interest makes total sense given our location and institutional partners, including New York Historical Society. So we're really delighted to be able to feature that today. But I think in a second and maybe more particular sense, today's topic gets to what I think of as a key feature of Bard Graduate Center, which is that we love to find connections and build bridges, between fields of academic inquiry that aren't always pursued in tandem. And I'm thinking of the task that, David, you set to explore this morning, the intersections between these emerging disciplines of visual culture, its own history and set of assumptions, and material culture with a slightly different history and often different set of material and different assumptions, obviously with productive overlaps. And here I have to confess that one of the things that makes Bard Graduate Center different from other academic think tanks is that we love to change our name. We've already done it twice, and I think the name you see on this podium, I can't guarantee it'll be our last. I think what that reflects is a search to articulate a field of inquiry that's not neatly encapsulated in any one phrase. And I'll tell you that the last time we went through this exercise, my personal suggestion was Bard Graduate Center for Studies in Visual and Material Culture. So that wasn't adopted, but I think there is something, next time, I think there is some truth in that. And I think that the relation between those two taglines, as it were, really remains at the heart of the institution. And so I really admire the way that today's papers will address the visual aspects of the material and the material aspects of the visual. And then finally, one of the raison d'etre of the Bard Graduate Center is really to be a kind of a forum or an entrepot for the exchange of people and ideas and discoveries. And we aim to be that for New York City. I think we're very successful, but obviously for the nation and the whole globe. And I was really delighted to learn at last night's pre-symposium gathering that some of you are old friends and some of you have never met except by print or by reputation. So that's wonderful, because if there's one thing we like to do here, it's to talk and bring people together. I think it's already started over coffee and breakfast, and I know we'll continue over coffee and other beverages throughout the course of the day. So let me hand the podium to David, who will kick off today's events. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey, as well as Dean Peter Miller for their support in making symposia such as this happen. I'd like to thank in particular my co-conveners, Kathy Kelly and Josh Brown, who've been involved in every facet of this project from the call for papers, which elicited many, many, many papers that we all read, and most of all to our panelists and chairs who are going to really take the rest of the day over. And finally to Dean Eleanor Pinto-Simon, and to Laura Minsky, who actually made this symposia happen. Material and visual culture studies of the America in general, in the 19th century in particular, have really, as Jeffrey said, really tracked distinct and intersecting paths. And what I thought of the occasion of this conference marks what we see as an increasing convergence of the field in thinking about the materiality of visual materials and the visuality of artifacts and other material objects. And I think you can see that in a series of conferences, just learning about a conference on the new materialism at University of Michigan that Rebecca Zurio, who's here with us, told me about. Also thinking of a host of volumes, collected essays. There was 2012 New Views of New England, Studies in Material and Visual Culture, that Kathy Kelly has a wonderful essay in on miniatures that does exactly what we're going to be talking about today and thinking about those two different angles and many others. And one of the editors of that, Martha McNamara, defined material culture studies can be succinctly described as an analysis of the artifacts of human endeavor with the goal of understanding their expressive function in a particular society at a particular time. And it's had a long material culture lineage. I'm not going to give you the history of that. That would take the rest of the day. A long lineage in the early American context in particular, going back to antiquarian studies of New England in the era of the colonial revival by historians such as Alice Morse Burrell, along with the introduction of the field in the academy, really in the 1960s, along with the new social history, through research that focused on furniture and vernacular architecture. And now that field has obviously morphed into other studies such as fashion and foodways. Visual culture studies, by contrast, emphasizes the act of seeing as embedded within disciplinary regimes, as opposed to the artifact's own expressive power. Here we're thinking of, hopefully, in historical character of a consciousness of vision and visuality, a history of visual culture of the 19th century, which might look at panoramas, wax museums, illustrated newspapers, and often, however, or in this, I think it's both a good and bad thing, looking back on those, let's say, 19th century technologies from a late 20th or early 21st century perspective. Vision is seen as a historically specific experience mediated by these new technologies. And however, these boundaries, I don't want to act like suddenly today or in recent days all this has happened. Crossing those boundaries has occurred over a long period of time. I could think back even in my own career to the work of Bob St. George or Robert Trent in New England Begins, thinking about some of the iconic objects in material culture studies, furniture studies, which would be Connecticut chests, and thinking about the visuality of those chests in New England Begins, or Bob's more recent work on Ralph Earl and gravestones and houses in Conversing by Signs, or another favorite of mine, Sumter Pretty, in his book on folk art and American fancy, who speaks about the exuberant modes of decoration on every possible surface that had been the illusion of decoration, that had the illusion of decoration in the 18th century, chests and these other pieces of furniture grained in imitation of more expensive mahogany. But what he focused on and what drew our attention and what caught my eye was that exuberant phase of fancy between 1850 and 1840 that abandoned all decorative restraint, splashing, and these are his words, splashing display across rooms, furniture, and paintings, filling the eye with dazzling scenes and providing the viewer with a store of unconventional images. Or, most recently, Jennifer Roberts' recent book on transporting visions, with its clearly entitled epilogue called Material Visual Culture, where she first, I think this was a lament, the under-theorized relationship of visual and material culture. Art history, she wrote, needs to look beyond the theories of illusion, representation, and iconography that underlie its formation as a modern discipline, and confront the unavoidable material basis of its referential operations. the weight and heft of the stuff of which its images are made. Likewise, although material culture offers inroads to the interpretation of things, it reaches a methodological impasse with representation, which by definition signifies something beyond the material specificity of a work. So these ideas are clearly in our thinking these days. And then finally, the long 19th century, which we also think of as a key element of this, it's really the third party here. Obviously an era of mass-produced images, the rise of lithographs and chromolithographs, illustrated newspapers, and again, Josh Brown's wonderful work on the illustrated newspaper has been a guide for many of us. Photography, of which we'll talk about today, and not just processes, but also display spaces. Perhaps not Benjamin's arcades, but certainly thinking about museums, galleries, exhibitions, World's Fairs, such as the Crystal Palace, which have become a favorite of mine, and really an age of intense visuality. And we can, I think, part of that discussion throughout the day. So objects enable the social world to happen, and we need to pay attention to what objects do and how they work. Long ago, Michael Baxendale, and again, I would throw Baxendale into this sort of mix, not just in his work on limewood carvers, extended to those limewood carvers of Germany to explain the reciprocal relationship between artifacts and culture. A society develops its distinctive skills and habits which have a visual impact, since the visual sense is the main order of experience, and these visual skills and habits become part of the medium of the painter. Correspondingly, a pictorial style gives access to the distinctive social experience. So I think we're very much in mind of the sort of three-cornered hat here of sort of social experience, the visual, and the material. And because materials matter to all of us in this room today, I also can't help but think about the tactile nature of globes, which are, of course, a work of wood, paper, and a work of knowledge as well, including an item of display and decoration. Or thinking about a chest of drawers, we can look at pattern books or contemporary objects to understand them, but we also want to think about the tools available on a cabinet maker's shop bench, which allow for certain possibilities and not others, and really the experience and the knowledge embedded in the maker's contact with the wood. These objects, as we'll look at, I think we agree, don't just exist as social markers, as signs of refinement, but they have much more. They have a material and visual presence. And then just finally, to make things a little more complicated, even more complicated, we can't assume continuities of taste across the continental of North America, much less across the diverse peoples that live in that space. The meaning of objects change over time and across social and physical space. And it's important to realize that new type of objects move through the social hierarchy. As they moved, they changed, as well as joining assemblages of objects, so thinking them as a vocabulary, as a grouping. So with that in mind, throwing out all those ideas, which will, of course, all be addressed and all answered by 3:15, but we will make progress. And because I really look forward to our panelists who will talk about frames and shields, images embedded on pages or raised on the page, or photographs performed in the studio or destroyed in acts of war.